Our next speaker is one of the most important scholars connected with studies of what happened in Eastern Europe during World War II. I know him personally. I know that he has no previous religious or ethnic or family background that led him to this study. I know that he had an interest in classical Russian literature, which took him to that part of the world. I know that he married a woman, a Ukrainian woman from the city of Lvov. I think they were married in Lvov, which is the city where my late mother was hiding for 14 months in the sewers. And so naturally, he and I have struck up a real bond since we got to know each other. He is a brilliant young historian. He received his PhD with distinction at Yale in 1990. He is currently the Associate Professor of History at Northeastern University, where for the last decade he has been mining archives in Russia, Ukraine, Germany, England, and the United States for a massive study of the Soviet war against Ukrainian nationalists, 1944 to 1953. His explorations of the war have led him to prepare a first volume of the planned two-volume study entitled Idioms of Hate, Soviet Collaborators in the German War Against, quote, Jewish Bolshevism, 1941 to 1944, expected to go to press in March of 2005. He has received major research grants from Fulbright Hayes, the International Research and Exchanges Board, the Social Science Research Council, the American Council for Soviet and East European Research, and 2 prestigious awards from the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. This year, he is a research fellow at the Holocaust Education Foundation, recipient of the Christopher Browning Research Fellowship. His remarks today about what happened to the Jews of Rovno are part of his broader exploration of Soviet civilian collaborators with the German occupation in the East during World War II. He has done significant, unique research in the archives in Ukraine that leads him to present us with a very important presentation about the Jews of Rovno. It's my great privilege to present Dr. Jeffrey Burds.
Thank you, David. It is very difficult to follow a survivor's testimony with a dry, scholarly approach to a question that cannot be presented in a dry, scholarly way. Recognizing that ahead of time, I decided to focus on the interweaving of a few lives that show up in the archives. Affidavits from 1944, very difficult to read, handwritten affidavits, testimonies at that time collected by the Extraordinary State Commission to chronicle the history of the German occupation in the Soviet areas. Now, because of the Cold War, these files were not available until the 1990s. And as they become available, the files in the East make it very clear that there is no problem whatsoever in proving to Holocaust deniers that there was a Holocaust, if such a thing, question even has to be asked. It's a ridiculous question. As David mentioned, I come to this not as someone with roots or family ties or religious ties to the area. I'm ethnic, if anything, ethnic Irish. I come to it because of a profound drive to try to understand the nature of the transformation of relations between people where groups of friends, literally in the case that I'll talk about, become perpetrators and victims. The recent work since 1991 on the history of the Holocaust now shows numbers that are much higher than we anticipated. There were 2.8 million Soviet Jews who died in the Holocaust in World War II, meaning that the 6 million, I think, is probably low and that we're going to find revisions upwards. What those who've been studying this at all understand is that the Germans made an active effort to destroy censuses and other materials that made it possible to chronicle these materials, and luckily through the meticulous work of hundreds of historians working now in the former Soviet Union, we've managed to reconstruct the new numbers. The question of collaboration in the annihilation of Jews and other minorities in these zones make it very clear that if there is a Vichy question, say, of the sort that applies to France, the inability to remember the nature of one's own personal relationship between the Nazi occupation and neighbor against neighbor violence, it is not even on the charts yet in Soviet historiography. In my book, I'm hoping we'll move towards taking the first step to completely redefine the question. For those who have ever read any history of the Soviet war in the East against the Germans, it tends to be presented as Jews equal with all Slavs, as Untermenschen, all to be destroyed. That is not the case. There were gradations of experience within the occupation in which Jews were a universal scapegoat, and other ethnic groups may have fell victim, but they fell victim for reasons other than the German war in the East. The nature of collaboration, just the data on that should give you a good sense. There were roughly 3 million armed collaborators with the German occupation in Europe. Over 2 million of these come from Soviet zones, and there is no literature, no discussion whatsoever about these. Mr. Preston's experiences are unique in that he is one of a few handfuls from the East who was moved westward into camps. The overwhelming majority of those who were killed, those Jews who were killed in the Holocaust in the East, are shot in large mass actions. And so the violence is very different, not the clinical, distant, factory-like violence of Auschwitz, but the personal, very intimate violence described in the fellowship that is, it was named after him, Christopher Browning, in his discussion of what motivated ordinary men, from working class men from Germany who had not been exposed to much of the Nazi ideology to become perpetrators in World War II. In my case, what I'm trying to do is try to understand the motivation of various ethnic groups to work with the Germans against the Jews, against the Soviets in some sort of combined war. I can't begin to answer that question in the short time that we have, but just to give you an idea, I've been moving through not just archives, but the recognition that archives themselves are part of the official story to be told. And the Soviet Union wants to talk about the German enemy against all Soviets, and yet there's an enormous amount of evidence about the fate of the Jews as well. I've had to go out of those archives in order to discover the nature of a vital and rich collaborationist culture of hate during the German occupation, in which German messages of hate are translated into local idioms by willing local collaborators who construct an extraordinarily painful history, but one that helped to mobilize enormous support. Just to give one example, what we've found in Belarusian archives in recent years is that the Soviet partisan resistance had a terrible time getting support, primarily because of the Jewish question, that the Belarusian peasantry simply was not sympathetic to any regime or restoration of any regime in which Jews would be given back their rights or a restoration of their property. It becomes a horrible question of self-enrichment at the expense of others, starting with the Jews and then other minorities throughout this zone. If you look at a map of Volhynia, of which Rovno is a part, or of Galicia, which is, there's western and eastern Galicia. If you look at a map of this zone for the 20th century, you'll find that, in fact, you go from a zone that was roughly 2/3 ethnic Ukrainian in the period just before 1918, just before the end of the First World War. Over the course of the next decades, there are 5 major ethnic cleansing operations. By the end of the 20th century, that is in the 1990s, the first decade after the liberation of Ukraine from the Soviet Union, as the official representation of it goes, you find that these zones are now more than 95% ethnic Ukrainian. That not just Jews who had once represented roughly 1 in 5, 1 in 4 of all people in these zones were gone by 1944, 1943, but also Volksdeutsch, the pre-war, post-war attacks against ethnic Germans, the pre-war, post-war attacks especially in 39 to 41 by the Soviets against ethnic Poles in these same zones, the wartime Ukrainian nationalist attack against ethnic Poles, so that the 20th century truly is a century of genocide, one in which the fate of the Jews is the most well-known and the most horrific precisely because of the nature of the brutalities. But it's clear that there's something special about these zones and the use of occupying authorities to settle local scores. Jan Gross, who's best known, I think, by all of us at this point for his extraordinary work on Jedwabne in July 1941, when half the village in eastern Poland rises up and murders the Jewish half in the first days of German occupation. That, after enormous controversy, has now been found to have been the pattern in at least 40 villages and towns in these regions, among them Rovno. When you're talking about the transformation of zones from a conception in which we all were exposed to it, of German violence against the Jewish people, to one in which we have to recognize that no, it's not just the Germans as perpetrators, but the so-called bystanders, the fellow victims among the Slavic groups, were major perpetrators as well. Jan Gross, in an earlier work, identified the intimacy of the violence that we must confront. For those who do not specialize in the history of this ethnic violence, it becomes very difficult to understand the degree to which genocide is a hate crime perpetrated not against random strangers in these zones, but more often than not, targeting personal contacts, people you knew. Jan Gross's observations of multi-ethnic Galicia just prior to World War II are especially relevant here, and I want to quote what he says. In these easternmost hinterlands of interwar Europe, each hamlet or village was to a large degree an isolated universe. As often happens in such an environment, intense personal hatreds were harbored, and an ethnic and religious component gave them the potential to engulf entire communities. Yet much as the violence represented an explosion of combined ethnic, religious, and nationalist conflict, I am nevertheless struck by its intimacy. More often than not, victims and executioners knew each other personally. Even after several years, survivors could still name names. Definitely people took this opportunity to get even for personal injuries in the past. Emmanuel Levinas has led the way, I think, in evaluating the nature, there we are, the nature of violence, where his writing that violence does not consist so much of injuring and annihilating persons as in interrupting their continuity, making them play roles in which they no longer recognize themselves, making them betray not only commitments but their own substance, is precisely what I'm trying to talk about here. When we're talking about intimate friends who become enemies across this divide of ethnic enmity, of Jewish scapegoating in Eastern Europe in 1941. What we're talking about is this public sphere of Eastern Europe in which these villages and towns that are multi-ethnic and live for centuries. There are pogroms. Pogrom violence, I want to point out, is not the same as what happens in the Holocaust. In pogroms, the basic goal of locals is to perpetrate violence against a few in order to drive away the many. It was a tactical means by which to exploit opportunities through violence, and it was certainly an act of ethnic cleansing. But something unique happens in 1941 in which the goals of the local perpetrators moves from pogrom history to a desire, a genocidal desire to resolve the Jewish question once and for all by killing all Jews in the region. It's no longer about deportation or exile or escape of Jews out of the region. It is very much about resolution through murder. Now, in the 1930s, Rovno was a town of about 60,000. of whom 24,000 were Jews. There were equal numbers of Poles and Ukrainians. By the commencement of the Second World War in 1939, Rovno was for almost 2 years under Soviet control, as much of these Curzon Line zones, the secret agreement between Hitler and Stalin in August of '39 that opens the way for the partitioning of Eastern Europe and the end of an Eastern Front threat for Hitler. During that period from '39 to '41, the Polish population was largely deported by the Soviets, while the Jewish population swelled to over half the city numbers in Rovno, swelled also by Jews who fled the German occupation of Poland. And so we have a population of 60,000 that stays more or less the same, but the Jewish proportion skyrockets. It's over 30,000, closer to 35,000 by 1941. With the attack on 22 June 1941, the annihilation of the Jews of Rovno occurs in 3 stages. By the end of 1942, Rovno is Judenrein. There are no Jews left. And the way this is accomplished is in 3 steps. About 3,000 to 4,000 Jews, the estimates vary, fled successfully before the Germans arrived. And these are, by and large, the Rovno Jews who are alive today and their descendants, to talk about the nature of the experiences. Among them is Kaya Musman in New York, who David helped to introduce me to, who helped to resolve some of the many questions I had coming out of archival affidavits. If you were a Jew and you remained, you did not survive, and Mr. Preston is among that very small minority, literally a few handful of Rovno Jews who survived the war and make it to the West. My guess, I didn't ask him, but my guess is that his French education is probably what saved him. He was treated like a European Jew instead of an East European Jew, and therefore entered a special category. It could be his engineering experience. It could be just a good day or bad day. It's hard to predict in individual cases. Roughly 3,000 to 4,000 Jews are murdered during the June, July, August melee, if you will, of neighbor against neighbor violence, the period of self-cleansing vigilante-style operations of the summer of 1941. That is where the Einsatzgruppen are there in the background, oftentimes helping to direct very willing nationalist sympathizers from the locale who lead street attacks in mass actions against the Jews. In Rovno, as in other cases, this was accompanied by exhumation of victims of Soviet terror, very real victims of Soviet terror. Hundreds of corpses from the NKVD prison yard, and it is this excavation that leads to a personalization of the Soviet terror, of the Soviet Jewish conspiracy against Ukrainians, against Poles, that transforms itself in the 20th century into a conceptualization that it's okay to commit genocide, to murder Jews, to reckon with Jews at this time. It's one of the most successful PR campaigns of the 20th century, the transformation of ethnic hatred in 39 to 41, especially 41. The Germans deliberately, and I was going to give some examples of the literature that comes out at this time. I just decided, because of the short time available, to take these away. But what you have is local newspapers that talk about those victims that everybody knows, and to say these are the victims of the Soviet Jewish conspiracy, and then people go out, they kill Jews in response, and everybody understands and agrees that this is a common war between the Germans, between the Ukrainians, between the Poles, against an enemy identified as the communists, the Jews, the Soviet communists, the Soviet Jewish communist conspiracy. I've been working for years to try to find, and I have now found over 40 different zones, 40 different areas in which Jews are forced, men, women, and children, forced to celebrate communist-style rituals before they're slaughtered. That is the ritualistic transformation of Jews into communists before they're killed. Oftentimes these are not by German aggression, but by locals who take these people at knife point and then have them tear down a local Lenin statue, for instance, have them sing communist songs or Jewish songs or Yiddish songs, and then destroy them and their lives in a highly public act of violence. I wanted initially just to give you some sense of just how decimated the zones were. to give you, I have maybe 12 slides I took from the archives about Rovno in 1945, 44-45. It is liberated by the Soviet Red Army in February of 44, but it's a front-line city and therefore is bombed at least 4 times between February and May of 1944. All of the Soviet Union is liberated of the German enemy by the end of July, beginning of August 1944. These photos give you a very good sense, I think. Let's see, we have the main street in Rovno in 1937. It was renamed as 3 May Street. And this same street, just 7 years later, that was the most recent picture I could find from a postcard before the war. 7 years later, you see that the city center has been absolutely decimated by combined German and Soviet bombing. Areas, this is the site of the former hotel, the main hotel in downtown Rovno is now just a giant gaping hole in the center of the city. You have the inside of the hotel is pretty much a mass of mortar and steel. Shevchenko Drama Center, which was the leading theater in Rovno, is likewise destroyed. For some reason, the pictures aren't quite so good on this particular image. The various schools that are destroyed, and I wanted to show that it wasn't just the Jews who were singled out, but the Jews are singled out in a special way that we'll see in a minute. The commercial center, likewise destroyed. The city and over 92% of its buildings are completely decimated by the war. Nothing is left standing. And this is unlike many of the cities of Galicia. For some reason, Rovno in particular, mainly because it's the seat of the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, is absolutely devastated in the course of the liberation and then the effort to roll back the Soviet presence. Now, I stopped for a moment to talk about Jewish buildings because there were special signs of a particularly brutal form of iconoclastic destruction of Jewish symbols in Rovno that I wanted to talk about. Destroyed more or less the same way. This is the synagogue in Rovno, the outside building. But what makes it very clear, and according to eyewitness reports, it was destroyed back in 41. It was not a victim of the bombing. And the way we can tell that this was a systematic destruction of a Jewish symbol is when you go in, and it was actually David who identified the, let's see, I think I've got a laser pointer. You can see the graffiti on the walls. And the graffiti is bawdy German hate graffiti about Jews in the Soviet Union. These symbols, and I blew them up a little bit just so you get a sense of what they look like. The fluorescent light makes it not show so well, but you have the image of Jewish motherhood turned into a caricature of the Jew whore concept that is often used in a lot of the occupation, the German occupation hate literature. You've got just signing people's names. You've got the symbol of Jewish boys peeing inside the synagogue. These things that the German soldiers, who have no sense whatsoever of what Judaism is, who are deliberately destroying in various ways the symbol of Judaism in Rovno. This is what distinguishes the destruction of Jews in Rovno as a hate crime, as distinct from victims of war. And I just want to make it very clear that the historical record makes that clear as well. Kaya Musman and I have met several times, but we had a long interview. She is one of those survivors from Rovno who evacuates in June of 1941. And she has left the best record, probably the best book that exists, a small Russian book talking about her destroyed city in which her parents and all her family were killed. She managed to escape because she refused to listen to her parents and stay. She ran away instead. What she talks about takes on a rather interesting image, because when I read her biography after we began to correspond, I found that she spends several whole pages talking about friends whose affidavits I already had in my possession from various testimonies that were in Ukrainian and Russian archives. In the beginning of the 1940s, she said, and remember this is under the Soviet power in which Jews are identified popularly as having been favored by the Soviets, a complete untruth. But what's true is that Jews are treated the same as other ethnic groups. And that in and of itself is a step up in areas that are the land of pogroms. So she writes, in the beginning of the 40s, we considered ourselves equals among equals. She writes very eloquently in Russian. I only barely capture it, I think, in my English translation. The time from 17 September 1939 to 22 June 1941, I remember as the brightest, happiest in my life. I was young, just 17, and found myself in my first friendship ever with a Pole, a Polish man, moreover, Jurka Nowakovsky. She had a boyfriend. The boyfriend was a Pole, which is extraordinary already. Washing our hands of old conventions, artificial barriers that divided the nationalities, we walked together about the town. I could feel the offhand stares cast by disapproving elders. But the times had so abruptly changed that even our rabbi from Kamenka, in whose home we lived, did not dare to make comments about my dates with a Polish boy, either to me or to my parents. Even things inside the rabbi's own home had changed. His son cut off his Hasidic curls and exchanged his black Hasidic greatcoat for a suit, and even joined some sort of labor union. Both of the rabbi's daughters likewise found jobs outside the home. The synagogue was deserted, and my own mama openly burned primus on Saturdays, while the rabbi's wife permitted me to pump water in her kitchen. All of these, of course, are radical changes in these Orthodox Jewish areas. It was a happy time, or perhaps it was not so much the time, but our age, our youth, which painted everything around us with radiant, joyous colors. Evenings, we usually became a foursome. My closest friend, Leah Botker, the most beautiful girl in our school, with her friend, Kostya Romsky, and I with Jurka. Kostya was older than us. He lived separately from his father and stepmother, with whom he had quarreled. His father, a well-known doctor in the town, was a baptized Jew, but I don't think this was the cause of their conflict. Once, during one of our walks, we met a funeral procession, the funeral of a Roman Catholic priest. Jurek suggested that we visit his grave. According to superstition, if you burn a candle on the fresh grave of a Roman Catholic priest at midnight, you can find out how long you will live. At first, Leah and I refused. It would be terrifying to walk among the graves at night. The boys laughed at us and made such a fuss that we all eventually agreed to go, electing to meet at the entrance to the main path of the Catholic cemetery at 15 minutes before 12 at night. Now, you can just imagine the lines that are being crossed by Jews going into a Catholic cemetery at night, especially with all of the rumors that always exist about blood libel and the sort. What are these two Jewish girls doing in a Catholic cemetery at night? So they're crossing barriers that are not just social barriers, but ethnic and religious and Jewish barriers as well. It was a warm, moonlit night in May 1940. The cemetery lay quiet, bathed in green, flooded with moonlight, but it seemed to us that spirits hid in the shadows of the gravestones. It's hard to say why Leah and I put up with this adventure. Jurek and Kostik waited for us on the main path. Upon seeing them, we breathed more easily. Jurek and Kostik chose not to tell them about Jurek and Kostik were waiting for us. We breathed more easily. Of course, we chose not to tell them about the frights we had endured, and the lads heartily congratulated us for our courage. Flowers lay on the fresh grave of the Roman Catholic priest. Kostya gave each of us a candle. We set them on the grave and lit them. 3 times Kostya lit his candle, and each time the flame went out. Our candles each burned differently. For some reason, mine began to melt. When we left the cemetery, we left behind just 3 burning candles. Kostya laughed nervously, but none of us saw much meaning in the extinguished candle. Who believes in death at 17? 2 weeks later, Kostya was arrested. We never saw him again, either before or after the war. Justice was, at that time, quite swift, and oh, so rarely just. Even now, I do not know what offense Kostya committed, or whether he even committed an offense against Soviet power. They did not repress his father. Kostya had never been a Zionist. Under the Poles, he had never collaborated with the Deuce, the Polish secret police. He had never been a member of either the underground communist or Trotskyite cells. In 1940, he had worked as a director of a pioneer's house, the local Cub Scouts, basically, for the Soviets. And as far as we knew, he had a good opinion of Soviet authorities. But this was how Soviet power was. They constantly needed victims in order to maintain fear in the rest of us. We did not even grow frightened at the time, mainly because we knew too little about Soviet power. We believed in it too much and nurtured the hope that someday they would realize their mistake and let Kostya go. But that would never happen. Now, the story of the three friends, Yurik, and Kaya Musman, and her best friend Leah, the most beautiful girl in the Rovno Jewish school, 10th class in 1940, is interesting because we have several affidavits from Yurik and Leah after the war. They manage to survive the war. Yurik as a Pole, Leah one of several dozen family members, the only one to survive. And it's from that point of view that it's especially interesting. Let's see, I have their picture. This is from Kaya Musman. The woman on the left is the beautiful Leah Bodker with a friend. I could not remember her name. Her first name, Savitska, was the last name. Their best friend, who was one of the 18,000, along with the Preston family, with the exception of George, who were murdered between November 6th and November 9th in an action that killed not just 18,000, as he suggested, but we now know on the basis of modern forensic evidence, 23,500 Jews were slaughtered in 3 days between November 6th and November 9th, 1941. The reason for the slaughter is grounded in the decision by Reichskommissar Erich Koch to establish his base of operations for the Reichskommissariat Ukraine in Rovno. Basically, he felt that it was necessary to cleanse as much of the new capital as possible of Jews, both to make an example for other areas, but practically speaking, it was a means by which to open up apartments and offices for his new German staff. As a result, over 80% of Rovno's remaining Jews, 17,500 adults plus 6,000 children, would be executed in those 3 days just to create office and apartment space for Germans. That includes members of your family. The standard story of the events that transpired at Rovno at that time can be traced to one affidavit, and what I'll do is read 3 affidavits before I come to an end in order to give you a sense of the horrors escalating with each step. Edward Rosenberg is born in 1893 in Latvia. He was a Jewish resident of Rovno and provided this handwritten affidavit on 21 November 1944. On the evening of 6 November 1941, notices were distributed, he wrote, that all persons without certifications from their place of work were required on the next day, 7 November, at 6 o'clock in the morning, to appear at the square on Grabnik Street with a 3-day supply of food. This was a common ploy, you probably know, that the Germans would know that if we say we want you to come out so we can kill you, no one would show up. And so instead, they created the impression that this was a work deportation. Believing the Germans planned to deport them, people took with them all of their best, most valuable possessions, continues Rosenberg. Early the next morning, it was still dark. Thousands of people filled the streets on their way to the square on Grabnik. Walking were women with children, old folks, young men carrying babies in their arms. When 17,000 people had assembled at the square, suddenly out of nowhere there appeared German and Ukrainian police armed with Tommy guns who surrounded the entire square in a double row. They ordered the people on the square to leave behind their things. Next, the police began to drive them like cattle through a field to a place called Sosinki, located 4 kilometers from Rovno. A large pit had already been prepared at Sosinki. The doomed people were ordered to undress and to stand at the edge of the pit. The naked people were shot with Tommy guns. Some tried to run away, but they were shot, and others were forced to carry their bodies to the pit. The slaughter continued for 3 days, day and night. Up until 1999, that was all we knew about the Rovno massacre. For some reason, this particular testimony had been released to the public while others had not, probably because they play a greater role in implicating the role of neighbors and Ukrainian police than this particular version. Now, Rosenberg was himself, he managed to survive largely by going to the forest and joining the partisans. And he learned after the war in 1944 that a certain Zubkov, a local neighbor, had been the one responsible for submitting a denunciation against him, his wife, and his family, who were all arrested and then shot at Sosinki. Under conditions that he never explains, he managed to survive. Rosenberg learned that Zubkov and his family had fled with the German SD to Lublin in Poland and eventually to the West. And he spent the rest of his life, he speaks about it here and again in subsequent affidavits, about his thirst for vengeance against this man whose writing on a piece of paper led to the destruction of his family. A memo from the end of November 1941 by the chief of Einsatzgruppe C that was responsible for the massacre, entitled "The Situation and Mood in Volhynia," provided an epitaph on why it had been necessary to annihilate 80% of Rovno's Jews, including your family members, in a single operation. I quote from paragraph 4, labeled "Jews." "It need not be particularly stressed," he wrote, "that communist agitators received very warm support from the Jews. Under the prevailing conditions, it was important to stop the activity of the Jews in Volhynia and to remove thereby the most fertile soil from Bolshevism. The extermination of the Jews, who are without any doubt useless as workers and more harmful as the carriers of bacilli of communism, was unavoidably necessary." The Soviet forensic investigation that comes afterwards in 44-45 produces what are the some very difficult photos. The next photo, and I just warn you in case you want to look away, is the only known photograph of corpses at Sosinki, taken secretly by partisans and kept in the folder. It has no explanation other than that in the files. It is a gruesome photo, but in this day of colored Stephen King-style films, perhaps is not as bad. I discovered it wholly by accident, and it had never been released to the public before I found it in '99. It still hasn't been published. Hippolyte Sitorsky provided an affidavit explaining that he had found it. It was a pocket photo of a German officer who was working in Rovno, and when he was arrested. This is, if you don't know, there was a certain culture of macabre photographs taken by German soldiers in the East that they carry with them. These photos were collected in archives in the Soviet Union, and they become the basis for the very controversial Wehrmacht war crimes exhibition, in which we move from just the SS and Gestapo and the Germans alone responsible for atrocities, but recognize that this became a matter of course if you served in the East, that the military was itself responsible. You find worse photos than this. I have now seen thousands of such photos. They are gruesome, and this is a horrible sight, but just the beginning. The forensic photos by the Soviets, these are 3 scenes from the Soviet forensic investigation. These are from the Sosinki main burial site, the place of 17,500 Jews, mainly adults and some children. They include the very close-up analysis. In this case, you see a mother with 2 children in her arms and 2 children next to her as well in the pits. The separate investigation of another site with over 6,000 children that was not known about until much later, and therefore most estimates at the time only mentioned 17,500 dead, was nearby in the same forest, but it consists only of children, and this photo is from that site. And so when you think about the precariousness of the existence of your own family, I think, comes much closer to understanding when you see just how few people managed to survive. It was not likely that one would survive at this time. Now, I want to go back, and this is the final picture that I have. I want to go back to the testimony of Leah Botker, who talks about her experience, and then the testimony of Yuri Novakovsky, her good friend, who becomes her husband, in talking about why people did this. Leah Botker's memoir is probably the most painful of them all. On 5 November 1941, notices were distributed that persons of Jewish nationality without certifications from their place of work were required to appear the next day. That is 6 November 1941 at 6 o'clock in the morning on Kostielnaya Square on Grabnik Street for evacuation from the town. Kostielnaya refers to a Polish church, so it's Polish Church Square in the center of Rovno. Before November 6, rumors had circulated around the town that we were all to be deported somewhere. No one even had the thought that they were assembling us to be shot. On 6 November, our entire family, father, mother, sister, brother, uncle, and aunt, walked to Kostielnaya Square on Grabnik. A wet snow was falling, a piercing wind was blowing, it was still dark, but thousands of people walked toward the square from all directions through the storm and bad weather. No one but Jews were on the streets since the order of the town Gebiets Kommissar had created an unusual situation. Moreover, it was still a restricted hour on the streets for persons not of Jewish nationality. There were the wartime curfews. Men walked with bundles on their shoulders. The Germans had permitted us to take with us our valuables and a supply of food. Women walked carrying children in their arms. Old folks came too. The healthy carried the sick. Toward 10 o'clock in the morning, we finally reached the square. It took her 4 hours to do a 10-minute walk because there were so many people pushing into this small square. Toward 10 o'clock in the morning, we finally reached the square. Even before arriving at the square, people began to sense something evil. All adjacent blocks had been sealed off by the SS and the local police. It was impossible to turn around and go back. The police would not have permitted it, and people were locked into such a dense mass that there was no room even to move, let alone walk against the flow. Pushed from behind and not seeing, the police pressed us into some sort of madness. Sometime between noon and 1 o'clock, the square was so packed with people that there was just no room for more Jews. A German climbed a hillock on the square and told the assembled crowd through a megaphone that they must leave here in a heap on the square everything they had brought with them, bundles, packages, suitcases, parcels, etc. These things would join them later, he promised. A half hour later, they had grown several mounds of such bundles. Next, they led us along 2 routes to village Sosinki, located, she recalls, some 2 to 3 kilometers walk from the town. Now there were 3 lines of local police and SS who escorted us. There was no possibility of escape. As we approached Sosinki, we understood that we were walking to our deaths. Before my eyes there appeared a nightmarish scene, one from which my blood freezes even now, more than 3 years later, though the threat of death has long passed. There was a ditch perhaps 100 meters long. Logs had been thrown across the pit. On the logs stood 10 to 20 people, arranged with the backs of their heads facing us. There was a long volley from Tommy guns, and the people fell into the pit like mowed ears of corn. Not far from the ditch were several more pits. Everyone was forced to undress stark naked and to walk up to the edge of the pit, men and women separately. Remember, it's very cold. It's probably about 25 degrees out. Every executioner practiced his own special type of murder. Some lined their victims up along the edge of the pit facing forward, and the German, by turns, shot each one in the back of the head. Others stood their victims on their knees in front of the pit, while others forced their victims to run towards the pit and shot them as they approached the edge, and so on. Some threw young children alive into the pits, while others hurled them into the air and shot them in flight. All of this was accompanied by deathly groans and screams of the dying and the peculiar laughter of the executioners. If one of the doomed tried to run off to the side, they shot him. Working this way for about 2 hours, the German would walk up to a table, drink a glass of vodka, snack on a sandwich with sausage, and then, afresh, continue his vile work. As night fell, naked and at the limits of exhaustion from what I had seen, I lost consciousness. I was saved that night by some sort of miracle. I crawled between the lines of police and reached my friends who lived at the edge of town. My entire family and all my relatives had been shot together with 18,000 Jews of Rovno. I do not know the names of the executioners. There were SS men, Gestapo, Ukrainian police. The shooting went on for almost 3 days. The ditches, we know from research, had been dug by Russian POWs days in advance before they were themselves shot in the site. And they, near the pits, functionaries of the Rovno Gebiets Commissariat, the local administrative elite, busily registered the names of victims and collected and inventoried their documents and valuables, and likewise there were crews filming the scene. Men of the SD Commando, the German secret police unit from Rovno, who until a few days before had formed a detachment of Einsatzgruppe 5C, were the main perpetrators. Their unit numbered between 80 and 100 men. But it was only with Yurik Novakovsky's testimony that we learned for the first time exactly the predominant role played by the Ukrainian police in this execution. I'd like to talk about the motivations behind the killings. We have, from 1962, the testimony of one of the German members of the unit, and I'll contrast that to Novakovsky's affidavit in a minute or two. In Rovno, and this is the statement of teleprinter engineer Kaibak from Einsatzgruppe C. In Rovno, I had to participate in the first shooting. Each member of the firing squad had to shoot one person. We were instructed to aim at the head from a distance of about 10 meters. I can no longer say today who gave the order to fire. At any rate, it was a staff officer. There were a number of staff officers present at the shooting. The order to fire was ready to shoot, aim, fire. The people who had been shot then fell into the grave. I myself was detailed to the firing squad. However, I only managed to shoot about 5 times. I began to feel unwell. I felt as though I was in a dream. Afterwards, I was laughed at because I couldn't shoot anymore. A private or lance corporal from the Wehrmacht, I don't know which unit, took my carbine from me and went and took my place in the firing squad. I went and stood about 50 meters away from the firing squad. It was obvious that I was in no state to go on shooting. The nervous strain was too great for me. When I am asked whether I was reprimanded for my refusal, I have to say that this was not the case. As I said, my own research has shown that Germans were the exception and not the rule at the annihilation of so many lives over the course of 3 days. At the outset, not all Ukrainian police were eager members of the mass execution of Jews. According to at least one of the affidavits, several of the Ukrainian executioners actually dropped their weapons and started running toward the pits rather than mow down Jews in this sort of modern genocidal act. Their commander shouted after them in a sort of joking way, "What's the matter with you, you Jew lovers? An order is an order." He thereupon gave the order, among other soldiers at the site, to shoot them in the back, and they were mowed down into the pits as well. Why would someone step forward and murder a neighbor? I think we fail to understand the difficulties of occupation regimes and the world turned upside down associated with collaboration with the Germans at this time. A Ukrainian collaborator who would, after the war, join U.S. intelligence was debriefed in 1945, left a transcript which was only declassified in 2003 in Washington. He talked about it from this point of view. Each man working for the Ukrainian section of Abwehr 3, the German military intelligence on the Eastern Front, and Krakow received a beautiful 2-room, fully furnished apartment, including a telephone and radio. Men who were stationed outside the city and the provinces also were furnished with apartments or little houses, including telephones and radios. Men operating in Krakow, in addition to German food ration coupons, also received special consignments of whiskey, cigarettes, clothes, food, etc. In the provinces, each German agent, Meldekopf they called them, was regarded as an official translator for the Zollkommissariat and received the same as a German officer's rations, which were given to all civil service workers. In addition, each worker received a steady pay ranging from 300 to 500 zloty, that's about 2 months' pay at the time, an operating expense account, and an extra compensation for reports, which varied depending on the degree of their importance. Some valuable reports would bring up to 2,000 zloty. Ukrainian sections in Krakow, as well as in the provinces, were furnished with safe houses where suspicious individuals were interrogated. Work, of course, for the Germans brought contacts, and contacts brought special opportunities that never have any written memory for us to pull out of the archives. A Lemberg woman, for instance, an ethnic Ukrainian who was interviewed in the same affidavit set that I found, was asked about her apartment that had formerly belonged to a Jewish family, and she at first expressed ignorance about where it had come from. She simply said, "Oh, it's always been my apartment, they knew better." Eventually, she admitted she had been a cleaning lady in Gestapo headquarters, and part of her reward for her open act of collaboration was a formerly Jewish apartment in the Tony section of town, in Rovno, to the extent that this was Tony at all. Service for the Nazis brought certain advantages that I can list endlessly. I'd like to move then to Yuri Novakovsky's report. And when I first read it in Moscow, I had no interest ever in working on Rovno. I was not going to pursue Holocaust studies. It was this affidavit, and that's why it was so amazing that Kaya Musman's boyfriend in 1940 happened to be Yuri Novakovsky. When I read it, it was one of these epiphany moments for me that brought me into this field, kicking and screaming at first, but now you can see I've kind of grown accustomed to it, I guess. What he writes is unique in that we go beyond the documentation, and he sort of turns the lens back on his own community, asking the perpetrators at Sosnki why they killed Jews there. I myself, wrote Yuri Novakovsky in 1944, I myself cannot tell you in detail about what happened at Sosnki since I did not see it. But people who took part in the shootings told me about it. Seva Maevsky, born 1921, by occupation a radio technician, worked with the Gestapo and later in German counterintelligence, attached to the communications department. And Georg Datsuk, an ethnic Ukrainian who worked as a translator in the Schutzpolizei and later in the Ukrainian-German SD, the German Security Service. Datsuk told me that at first it was uncomfortable for him to shoot defenseless people, moreover ones that were naked and lying on the ground face down. Among those whom he, Datsuk, shot were several of his own acquaintances, Jewish girls with whom he had met earlier on social occasions, some with whom he had even studied at school. But Datsuk said he had to shoot even them. It was the norm, Datsuk continued, to develop a taste for blood, for murder. An older policeman, I do not now recall his name, showed him by example how to do it, and then Datsuk began to fire next, to shoot into the backs of their heads, and then to throw the bodies into the pit. They did not shoot the children. They didn't want to waste the bullets, and instead just hurled them live directly into the pits. I have survived horrors, says Datsuk, that even Job never faced, which is a especially curious statement. Maevsky bragged that following the mass shootings at Sosnki, he collected so many gold watches, coins, bracelets, and other Jewish items that he had enough for the rest of his life. Sergei Lashuk, about 35 years old, residing in Rovno, also took part in the shooting of the Jews. I have to say, when I shared this affidavit with Kaya Busman, she broke down into tears when we were talking, because it turns out that Georg Datsuk, who had developed a taste for killing Jews, who remembered the uncomfortable feelings he had killing classmates of Kaya Busman's from the Jewish school in 10th class, he was a member of their group. They were friends. He was a good, decent boy, she said, and I can't believe that he did these things. And that these were the words of her best friend, the man she loved, Yuri Novakovsky, about their friend, his own dismay, made it absolutely true. It was this moment for her that she will probably never forget as well. It was just very clear that for her, the Holocaust was something she had known, she had hated, but to learn that one of her close friends from her own circle had murdered other friends in their circle at this time, and then talks in this arrogant way about it afterwards, really shook her. What she writes in her book is most extraordinary, and what you'll find is an interesting discrepancy that I will end with today. Telling the story about the Jews, she wrote, of my massacred town, I also want to talk about my friend, the Polish boy, Yuri Novakovsky. He turned out to be a genuine person, a person with a capital P. My girlfriend Leah did not succeed in evacuating in summer 1941 and remained in Rovno. Like all the other Jews of the town, in November 41, Leah, her parents, and her younger sister Mina went to Grobnik's. From there, the Germans drove them on foot in small groups to the woods, to a forest named Sosnki, where they shot them. When the group containing Leah and her parents came near to Sosnki, they could hear shots being fired, and Leah's father commanded his wife and daughters to run. Leah rushed into a nearby field as guards fired after her, but fortunately no one chased after her. Leah ran to a haystack, climbed inside, and hid there until dark. That night she went to a cottage of Ukrainian peasants who took her in, fed her, and gave her a change of clothes. She was wearing a fine cloak and dress. Leah gave these to her hosts and took them from them in exchange peasant clothing, in which she returned to the town to her empty house. At home she found no one. Her parents, sister, all her neighbors had been killed. She was alone on a dead street. Several days later, Yuri Novakovsky found her and took Leah home with him, hiding her in his attic. In some sort of village church, he persuaded a drunken Catholic priest first to baptize Leah, who became Christina, and then to marry them, and she became Christina Novakovska for the balance of the war and until the end of her life. Yurek took his new wife to Zdolbunova, 12 miles from Rovno, and they lived there together for the rest of the German occupation. Kaya Musman added that the priest agreed to help in exchange for a couple of bottles of vodka. That was all it took to buy freedom from execution. After the war, Yuri Novikovsky was so shocked by the behavior of Poles and Ukrainians during the war that he converted to Judaism. They raised a son, also Yuri, who's now a professor in New York and lives out in Port Washington. Yuri died in the 1980s in Rovno. Leah emigrated after the end of the Soviet Union and died in Sweden in 1997. Piotr Wrobel is a Polish historian who's been dealing with ethnic memories, and he asked a few years ago, he introduced the concept of double memory for the study of the Second World War, especially of the Holocaust, and he asked, how is it that we can reconcile memories? If you ask a Pole about the World War II, he will have this sense of victimization. Oh, we were slaughtered by the Germans, 3 million Poles, no one else was slaughtered so much, was oppressed so much. And if you ask a Polish Jew the same question, of course, there is no overlap whatsoever in their memories of the war. The challenge is, of course, to try to take the disparate ethnic memories of the past and bring them into one whole. I would argue that meetings, reunions like yours today, the testimonies of George Preston and so many others do get remembered. They do get found. These pieces are brought back together and people don't forget. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have time for a couple of questions. We are running behind schedule, so we'll take that into consideration, please. But if you have a couple of questions, I'm sure Jeffrey Burds would be happy to answer them.
Yes, hi.
What is the Extraordinary State Commission?
It's called the Extraordinary State Commission for the Investigation of German Atrocities in Soviet territory. It's CHGK in Russian. It's a collection at the State Archive of the Russian Federation in Moscow. It has over 1 million files just remembering the Second World War. And so although there is this official version of the war that comes out because of Soviet and the Cold War afterwards, the documents, the affidavits, the materials that they collected at the time are probably the freshest and best that we have. And they don't have much in the way of editing. Oftentimes you have a questioner who says, we want to hear about the Germans, not about your neighbors, but people insist. No, no, no. Zubkov is still walking around the streets, for instance, and so one can go back to these documents now and ferret out a different truth. It's a good example of being able to use an extraordinary paper trail left by, admittedly, a totalitarian government, but to do solid social history and to invent our conceptions of the Second World War, one that has far more depth, far more intimacy, where we don't just have some amorphous mass of perpetrators, bystanders, and victims, but we can do this level of detail where you know what they were thinking at the time on each side and do a sort of multi-dimensional reconstruction of the past, which until recently was impossible. It really took the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But that collection is extraordinary. Yes?
Let me just interrupt before the next question. You know, I can't emphasize enough how relevant Dr. Burds' presentation is, because and my father's presentation, because what you've heard basically is what would have happened if your grandfather had not come to this country, and your parents individually had not come to this country. Sadie and Liba and Pina and Ethel, and who else am I thinking of? Jake. And the only one who stayed behind was my grandfather, and he and my uncle were among those murdered in the way that Dr. Burds grimly described. So truly, this is a very important presentation for us all to consider.
I have a question that relates to just what you said. I would like to know two things. I'd like to know from George, and I would also like to know from you, why didn't people leave? Why, you know, why, it was clear, I mean, that things were getting worse.
Mhm.
Why didn't they leave? And George, why did your family stay?
And I forgot Jenny too, right? I forgot Jenny.
I guess you wanted to know why didn't people leave? And it seems to me that George would probably answer that better than I could. I have the academics version. The academics version is that people don't anticipate disaster. Why don't people leave when there's a hurricane coming right at their house? You want to stay. You think that you're under control. You think that it's not going to be any worse than what you had before. Remember, these zones were Austro-Hungarian up till 1917, 1918. Most people were German-speaking, and they didn't have bad memories of the Germans. In 1941, though, many Jews do try to leave, and they are turned back by the Soviets. The Soviets are afraid of fifth columnists all the time, that is, spies who will penetrate the border, and if you don't have a reason for crossing over, they don't want to let you in. And that, too, will determine whether you're able to get out or whether you can't. Oftentimes, parents said, you stay home, you know, this is our life. We have to live with what we have here. And when you look at the oral histories, that's what's there. But I'm sure George has a much better answer.
It is true. I mean, people just did not believe that Dr. pointed out that something can be done. Like I said, homo homini lupus est, that man is wolf to man. The people that remained there, I remember when I was in Auschwitz, when the Hungarian Jews were actually driven to with all their belongings right to the gas chambers. And we were fortunate at that time that I was still working with a shovel right there in Auschwitz before I actually was assigned to the Siemens Commander. And they asked us, well, Kinderlach, I joking, I say, but how is it we were told that we are going to work? And I knew at that time that they were going direct to the gas chamber. They still didn't believe that things like this can happen. Now, as far as my father is concerned...
And that was already 1944.
41, yeah, 41.